My name is Kevin Perjurer. I investigate theme park rides that have been closed, offed, killed. This time of year, most people are thinking about decking the halls and what presents they're going to get their loved ones. Usually I would be too, but at the moment, I can't focus on neither the holly or the jolly. I am haunted. Haunted by a photograph. This photograph. That's right, jolly old St. Nick. He has his own theme park. Or had. That's just the tip of the North Pole. Take a look at this one. That's not a different angle. That's a different park. And this one. A third. I went down that reindeer hole quicker than you can say eggnog. I have questions. How many Santa-themed amusement parks are there? Why are there so many? What happened to them? Most importantly, who or what is responsible? Exhibit A. Santa Claus is coming to town. In 1849, a small community was developed in rural Indiana. It wouldn't be until the early 1850s that the townspeople would organize an official township by means of applying for a post office. They submitted the application under the name Santa Fe, which the United States Postal Service rejected. The more recognized Santa Fe had been taken by the U.S. military just 8 years prior along with the rest of the New Mexico territory. But the reason for the Postal Service rejection was actually because there already was a Santa Fe, Indiana, just north of Indianapolis. The veto meant that the townspeople would have to rename their community. The town formerly known as Santa Fe, Indiana, would eventually decide on the name Santa Claus, Indiana. The legend told throughout the town was that the debate was settled on Christmas Eve, when the townspeople gathered in the church and a gust of wind blew the front doors open, exposing the sound of sleigh bells in the distance. The children in the church, hearing the sounds, all ran to the door exclaiming, "It's Santa Claus!" and the name stuck. This story is apparently entirely made up, and the most likely reason is that someone said it as a joke in a meeting and no one could come up with anything else. The town officially became Santa Claus, Indiana on May 21, 1856. Almost immediately, the town's post office received letters from children addressed to Santa Claus. It wouldn't be until over 50 years later in 1914 that the town's new postmaster, James Martin, would begin responding to a few of the letters as the Jolly Man himself. 16 years later, in 1929, Robert Ripley would feature the town in his popular newspaper series, Ripley's Believe It or Not. After this, the town's post office was flooded with letters, and Santa Claus, Indiana was given a national spotlight. Seeing a prime opportunity for some good old-fashioned Christmas commercialization, an attorney named Milton Harris approached Postmaster Martin about an idea to profit off of the attention the town was receiving. He suggested a Christmas-themed park where children could play and their parents could buy gifts. This idea could be considered the world's first themed attraction. Disneyland would not open for another 20 years, and Knott's Berry Farm was nothing more than a restaurant until 1940 and arguably not an amusement park until the late 60s. Postmaster Martin, now nationally recognized and referred to as simply Santa Claus, would pass away in April of 1935, just months before the park opened. Harris would open his creation, named Santa Claus Town, on December 22, 1935. The park boasted a candy castle and a toy village, complete with merchandise and sponsors. Despite Santa Claus, Indiana having a population of 67 people, 7,000 attended the opening. Harris was not celebrating, however, as on the other side of the town's only street, a Chicago businessman named Carl Barrett had erected a 22-foot granite statue of Kris Kringle. Not only was Barrett announcing his own Santa-themed amusement park, to be named Santa Claus Park, but he had also bought the land that Harris was leasing for Santa Claus Town, resulting in conflicting ownership of the land in Santa Claus. A highly publicized court battle ensued, with the entire country on the edge of their seat, waiting to find out who would get legal authority to milk the birth of Christ in a town of less than 100 people. The battles raged on for years, but the legal proceedings were not the only issue. A portrait of Santa Claus in Harris's Candy Castle came under fire for its depiction of the holiday icon holding a sword. The townspeople demanded that the sword be painted out and be replaced with a trumpet, which Harris did without question to better his chances of winning the court case. On the other end of the street, the statue that Barrett had advertised as granite had almost immediately developed a crack on its exterior, proving it to be merely concrete, which did not help his case. While the proceedings continued, an auto company would attempt to purchase the town of Santa Claus for $100,000, and a soda company would attempt a purchase of $750,000. The latter would be just under $14 million today when adjusted for inflation. Both attempts were unsuccessful, but they were proof of the small town's prominence in the late 1930s. By this point, the post office was receiving 60,000 letters a day during the Christmas season, and the new postmaster Oscar Phillips had enlisted the help of his wife and 5 children to respond to as many of the children's letters as possible. As if things couldn't get any more chaotic, a mysterious man purchased post office box number 1 in the town. The shipping name on the box was Santa Claus. Disappointingly, this was not the real Father Christmas come to save a town in way over their heads. It was a Michigan auto worker named Jack Cannon that had legally changed his name to Santa Claus in another attempt to profit off of the town's name. When he arrived to Santa Claus after the long journey from Michigan, he found that there was no room available in the town, a hilarious circumstance that was unfortunately overshadowed by the conflicting businessmen. The two continued to run their parks. Harris is operating under the company Santa Claus Inc., and Barrett's operating under the company Santa Claus of Santa Claus Inc. Finally, in July of 1940, the case made it all the way to the Indiana Supreme Court, which overturned a previous ruling halting Barrett's development of his park. This meant that Harris would not have a monopoly on the town of Santa Claus, but he would get to keep the land he built Santa Claus Town on, which unfortunately had become a lot less lucrative over the past 5 years. The United States' involvement in World War II in 1941 would end the hopes of a larger fairy tale theme park once dreamed by both entrepreneurs. But in 1946, a year after the war ended, the town of Santa Claus would catch the attention of yet another businessman. This man, Louis J. Koch, had much better intentions. After noticing that Santa Claus, Indiana lacked a meet and greet with the man himself, he set off to solve the problem, eventually landing on a year-round theme park called Santa Claus Land that opened on August 3, 1946. This is often credited as the first theme park in the world, as Koch's park was complete with a meet and greet, a restaurant, and attractions. The park was a huge success, and it would remain open for years, eventually rebranding to include other holidays and changing its name to Holiday World. The park continues to operate successfully today. Harris's Candy Castle also remains in the town of Santa Claus, seeing a regular use around the holiday season, and Barrett's statue still stands, now outside of a Santa Claus museum. The rise of Santa Claus, Indiana is a bizarre tale, but is merely the groundwork for my case. Commercializing Christmas with a Santa-themed theme park was a revolutionary concept, and as with any such idea, it would attract imitators. Exhibit B, I'll Be Home for Christmas. In 1937, another town named Santa Claus would be established. This community was located in Arizona right off of the heavily trafficked Route 66. It was founded by Nina Talbot, a West Coast realtor who billed herself as the biggest real estate agent in California due to the fact that she weighed over 300 pounds. In the 1930s, Talbot had the idea to create an entire resort town themed around Kris Kringle, where she would take on the role of Mrs. Claus. The idea was a success. It was the perfect roadside attraction that one would expect to find alongside Route 66 during those days. Parents and children could come to meet Santa any day of the year, and the town's post office was the perfect spot for parents to send their children's letters to Santa. The town was also famous for the Santa Claus Inn, which was later renamed to the Christmas Tree Inn. The eatery served dishes such as chicken a la North Pole and rum pie a la Kris Kringle. Incredibly, the restaurant received high praise from the famous food critic Duncan Hines. After a 12-year run, Talbot realized her dreams of a full-blown resort town were falling short, as the only people who stayed in the town were the employees who worked there. She sold the town in 1949 as it was currently functioning as nothing more than a cute-themed roadside attraction that also had a restaurant. For a few years after that, the town of Santa Claus retained relevancy in American pop culture. The Christmas Tree Inn drew celebrity visitors when actress Jane Russell threw a dinner party there in 1954. However, it seemed Christmas couldn't last forever. Once the popularity of Route 66 died down, so too did the popularity of the town called Santa Claus, eventually leading to its fate as a roadside ghost town. Today, the town of Santa Claus has officially been removed from Arizona maps, but those that drive past will see the remains of what was once the holliest, jolliest town in the West. Exhibit C, Do You Believe in Santa Claus? The first Santa-themed theme park not to be located in a town named Santa Claus would open in Wilmington, New York in the summer of 1949. Created by local businessman Julian Rice, Santa's Workshop allowed children to visit the North Pole, with various buildings being constructed, each with a unique activity inside. The park was an immediate success, seeing 50,000 visitors in the first 2 months of operation. Walt Disney himself was rumored to have visited the park before the opening of Disneyland to consult with Rice on the design of Santa's Workshop. The humble park is still open today, but its popularity has declined significantly, and the management is having trouble making ends meet. As the park's current owner Doug Waterbury described it, the problem seems to be that in the 1950s, quote, a 13-year-old might still believe in Santa Claus. It's unusual today that a kid over 7 or 8 still believes. There's an urgency to get families to bring their kids here before they grow away. The park is still open, but its future is uncertain. Exhibit D, Baby It's Cold Outside. Born in 1918, Glenn Holland grew up in Arcadia, California, and spent his childhood years surviving the Great Depression. By the time he turned 18, both his parents had passed away, leaving him the sole caretaker of his younger sister. Holland's drive to build a theme park came from his desire to give kids like his sister a place where they could escape reality. According to his daughter, Pamela Holland Reese, quote, "He wanted Christmas to be just magical. He always thought that children should have adventures and great happiness in their lives. He wanted to make that come true." Holland was supposedly inspired by Santa's workshop in Wilmington. In the early 50s, Holland began sketching out his own version of a Christmas theme park. He wanted his park filled to the brim with holiday magic, larger-than-life festive attractions that would immerse visitors in the Christmas spirit. He took this concept and began selling it to investors. Holland leased land in Lake Arrowhead, California, just north of San Bernardino, and it was there that his Christmas fantasy, Santa's Village, would come to life in the spring of 1955, just 6 weeks before Disneyland would open. On that opening weekend, the park's general contractor recalled that the traffic was, quote, "backed up all the way down the mountain." Thanks to Holland, Christmas had come to California early, and it was a smash hit, but he wasn't done yet. Holland went on to open 2 more Santa's Village theme parks. The first would be located in Scotts Valley, California, and would open in 1958. This marked the first time a theme park had ever been franchised in the United States. The Santa's Village parks were filled with petting zoos, live reindeer that would pull a sleigh, train rides, something called a whirling Christmas tree ride, and holiday-themed playground areas for children to explore. Part of Holland's success was his commitment to theming. He even went so far as to develop a passport ticket that families could use instead of paying cash. Families would get their ticket punched for every purchase they made throughout the park, and then the parents would cash out their ticket at the end of the day with an employee. Holland believed that this would preserve the magic for the children. The third and final Santa's Village would open in 1959 in East Dundee, a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. Tragically, this park would be considered the downfall of the Santa's Village theme parks. It seemed that moving east would be a smart business decision, considering the immense popularity of the first 2 parks in California. However, Chicago's climate is slightly different than that of Southern California, notably the existence of a winter season. The decision to develop in East Dundee was a huge misstep for the franchise, as the park couldn't even be open on or around Christmas. And for a park themed entirely around that concept, this did not exactly bode well for business. When investors began to panic and pull out in 1965, a broken-hearted Holland sold the business and officially left the company. He lived out the rest of his life as a real estate developer and passed away in 2002. The park in Scotts Valley would close in 1979, the one in Lake Arrowhead would eventually close in 1998, and the park in East Dundee would surprisingly last until 2006. The parks would sit abandoned for years. Eventually, the parks in Lake Arrowhead and East Dundee would reopen in 2016 and 2011 respectively, under new management. They now operate a Sky Park at Santa's Village and Santa's Village Amusement Park. The Amusement Park, as that terrible pun implies, is now more of a zoo, and Sky Park at Santa's Village is oddly enough part BMX course. Though these parks had evolved drastically from their original forms, they both remember their roots and pay homage to their original creator. Glenn Holland came from hardship to build something magical and full of whimsy, a place for people to forget about life for a little while and celebrate a popular holiday year-round. According to his daughter, quote, "He knew he had touched people with those parks. It was the most special thing he felt he had ever done." Exhibit E, Where Are You, Christmas? Parque Albanol in Brazil was meant to be the largest theme park in the entire country, and it was going to be comprised of multiple themed lands, including an Old West town, a water park, a concert hall, and more, spanning over 38 million square meters. For comparison, that's about a third of the size of the entire Walt Disney World Resort in Orlando. The park's creator was politician Antonio Albano Reis, who had a knack for dressing up as Saint Nick during the holidays. His love of Christmas culminated in the idea for the park, but he was tragically struck and killed by a car just outside of the park's entrance during construction in 2004. Without its fearless leader at the helm, the plans for Parque Albanol were abandoned. Today, there are a plethora of truly eerie photographs that can be found. Massive candy canes and galloping reindeer stand rushing amongst a jungle backdrop, and Santa heads with gaping mouths, frozen and permanent ho-ho-hos, will surely replace those sugar plums dancing in your head at night. Exhibit F, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. In the mid-1950s, radio pioneer Jack Papel put up $125,000 for the creation of yet another Santa theme park in Vermont. The product was a small Christmas town with such attractions as a post office and a ding-dong school. It would also feature a petting zoo where children could get up close and personal with reindeer. The animals attracted not only families, but also one lazy hunter that purposefully shot 2 of the captive animals. Santa's Land in Putney, Vermont opened on August 10, 1957. Papel would add more attractions to the park, most notably a Humpty Dumpty roller coaster in 1960. He would own the park for another decade before selling it in 1970 to a local family who would own it for the next 30 years. The park would be passed to yet another owner in the early 2000s, but this is when luck for Santa's Land would run out. The new owner was struggling to turn a profit off of the over 50-year-old park, and in 2011, the park announced that it would not reopen for the 2012 season. An auction of the park's remaining assets were planned for 2012, but the event was canceled when the park had mysteriously been purchased by an anonymous buyer. Speculation of the buyer's identity ranged from Vermont Governor Peter Shumlin to WWE superstar Mick Foley. It turned out that the new owner was Vermont local Lillian Belowicz and her family. She announced her excitement in acquiring the park and for the upcoming 2013 season, although concerns were raised about the park's condition, as many of the attractions and facilities had not been updated for decades. These concerns were not misplaced. Santa's Land underperformed in its first season under new ownership, and the park closed its doors, with no plans for a 2014 season. Things would only get worse from there. In March 2014, when a county sheriff visited the park to return a lost license plate that belonged to the park's animal handler, Brian Deisler, he felt that something wasn't right in Santa's Land. An investigation of the property was launched by the county sheriff's department. Investigators found 18 animal carcasses, 16 deer, a pheasant, and a pot-bellied pig. The petting zoo animals that were still alive were extremely malnourished and on the brink of starvation or dehydration. Belowicz and Deisler were both arraigned with a misdemeanor and forced to follow strict guidelines to save the animals. Another sweep of the property in September of that year revealed that the guidelines were not being met, resulting in the confiscation of many of the petting zoo's animals. Only 17 deer would remain in the park's hands, with the goats, donkeys, ponies, emus, and llamas being put up for adoption. Belowicz would file for bankruptcy around this time, and the park would remain closed, falling into disrepair. The park quickly became worn by weather, vandals, and thieves, appearing as if it had been abandoned for decades in just a few months. It would remain abandoned for years, until in 2017, when a man named David Haversat would reopen the park. He did his best to repair the tattered buildings and attractions, as well as adding some new offerings. Unfortunately, a statue of Humpty Dumpty was completely destroyed, and no one could put it back together again. Haversat did not reopen the park's petting zoo for obvious reasons, although he left the pen standing in case he ever changed his mind. Haversat did an incredible job saving the historic park. He would even receive the Preservation Trust of Vermont Award for his effort in restoring Santa's Land. Exhibit G, 12 Days of Christmas. Opened in 1953, Santa's Village in Jefferson, New Hampshire is one of the most successful themed amusement parks in the world. The management's dedication to adding new rides has resulted in a modern park despite the antiquated theming. The park is still thriving today. In 1955, another Santa's Village opened outside of Bracebridge, Ontario. It is a similar setup to all of the other Santa theme parks, but one unique feature is this awesome-looking reindeer roller coaster, or at least I thought it was unique until I found that 2 other Santa theme parks had the exact same ones. The park is still operating today, and has expanded to include ziplining and ropes courses. Santa's Workshop is another currently operating Santa-themed amusement park located in Cascade, Colorado. The family-run park opened in 1956, and it is still owned and operated by its founders. In 1966, another Santa's Land would open in Cherokee, North Carolina with a similar concept and execution as the others. It is also still operating today. Opening in Miami in the 1980s, Santa's Enchanted Forest claims that it is the largest holiday theme park in the world, with over 100 festive activities to choose from. Santa Claus Village opened its doors in Finland in 1985 and remains a booming tourist destination to this day. The park is located inside the Arctic Circle, an ideal backdrop for the official hometown of Santa Claus. You can meet Santa year-round, and the park has a special event on Christmas Eve where visitors can count down and watch their beloved Santa Claus ride off into the sunset on a sleigh pulled by actual reindeer. On December 8, 1984, Santa World in Morris, Sweden opened its doors. The park is a recreation of the North Pole, and families continue to come to meet Santa and his elves, tour his workshop, meet his reindeer, and encounter whatever this thing is. Conclusions. My findings revealed 3 abandoned then reopened, and 9 operating Santa-themed theme parks. This is enough to fill my stockings, but when you look at each individual case together, a strange pattern emerges. Notice that 8 of these theme parks opened within 10 years between 1949 and 1959. Only 1 of them opened in the 1960s, and then none in the 1970s. All of a sudden, 3 more pop up in the 1980s. The only Santa park to be constructed in the 2000s was Park Avenel, and since then, no major Santa-themed amusement parks have been developed. My focus is on these 2 peaks, in the 40s and 50s, and again in the 80s. The peak in the 40s and 50s actually has a simple explanation. Before World War II, Germany was a major manufacturer of the Christmas products that the United States and other countries imported for the season. This included decorations and toys. After World War II, with Germany's manufacturing industry destroyed and the United States stronger than ever, the US was able to produce the necessary Christmas products and then some. It was in this area that Christmas made a large impact on popular culture. Most recognizable movies, songs, and also theme parks came from the 1940s and 50s. The slump in Christmas culture in the late 60s and 70s and rebound in the 80s is where my theories come in. My first theory is that the typical cycle of media resulted in the short hiatus. Pop culture comes in waves, sometimes naturally by Hollywood's inability to sustain quality production, and sometimes purposefully by companies attempting to avoid consumer fatigue. This is evident just by looking at the Christmas films produced in the 70s versus those produced in the 80s. This could be the reason that the Santa-themed amusement park trend came back for a short time in the 80s in the US and European countries. The second theory is that the slump in the 60s and 70s was a result of the lack of Christmas celebration during World War II. Children growing up in the 30s and 40s would be raising children of their own in the 60s and 70s, and if they grew up with a lack of Christmas commercialization during the Depression and Second World War, they would presumably be less likely to give their children the same holiday experience that those growing up in the 50s enjoyed. Likewise, those children growing up in the 50s would be raising their own children in the late 70s and 80s. That demographic would be more likely to give their children the commercial Christmas experience, similar to the one they had in the years after the war. This theory seems to be corroborated by a study from the Pew Research Center, revealing that children that were raised in the 1940s, 50s, 80s, and 90s reported that Santa visited them on Christmas Eve more often than those that were raised in the 60s and 70s. As with most cases, the moment you publish your findings, the more evidence comes out. Did I miss any parks? Could I have brushed over any events in my research? These are the kind of things that keep me up at night. But this time of year, I don't mind it. Seeing the snow float to the ground, blurred by the frigid air clinging onto the window pane, beautiful lights wrapped around houses and trees, and in the distance, sleigh bells? Could it be Santa Claus?